Hi, and welcome back to Continual Fandom. I'm your host, Jim Nettles, and tonight it's time to put on those bowler hats and time to meet the original Avengers. Before we go too far down the pike tonight, though, let's see who all is coming to join and talk about this spy series. So, Jeannie, you're up first.
All right. I'm Jeanne Adams. I write urban fantasy and paranormal romantic suspense, and I love me a good spy story.
Stephanie?
Hi, everybody. My name is Stephanie Burke. I'm also known as Flash, and I'm a USA Today best-selling author of everything. And I really, really, absolutely love the original Avengers. I wanted to be Mrs. Peel when I was a kid. We're going to get into that because the spies and the espionage and everything is so wonderful. I wish I could write it better, but, I can always read other people, and then I can always go back and watch my, my reruns.
John?
Hey, I'm John L. French, retired crime scene investigator, did 35 years plus on the streets of Baltimore and live to tell about it. Right now, I am I'm a writer, mostly hard-boiled crime with some paranormal and horror thrown in.
Ed?
Hi, everybody. I'm Ed McKeown, science fiction writer based here in Charlotte, North Carolina. Primarily known for my Morrow AI series. Also martial arts instructor, sometime ballroom dancer. Much better at the martial arts than the ballroom dancing, but, I try.
And Jean Marie?
Hello, my name is Jean Marie Ward. I write fiction, nonfiction, and everything in between. My most recent release is Siren Bridge, a comic fantasy western from Falstaff Books, and I take issue with the fact that Mrs. Peel and John Steed are not the original Avengers.
Well,
Honor Blackman fan has snuck in.
She wasn't even the first.
That's true.
Because John Steed was not the original lead.
No, it was another. Oh my goodness!
It was another guy. Yeah,
it was a doctor.
Yeah, he was a doctor, and everybody found him really boring. And they had a succession of forgettable females until Kathy Gale showed up, and she basically started the leather pants thing because every time she was doing the fight scenes, her crotch split. So they put her in leather pants. Obviously, nobody in the costume department had ever heard of gussets. And then, of course, she left, and they went through a very large talent search for a replacement for Kathy Gale, who had gone off to star in Goldfinger. In fact, in a future episode, in a subsequent episode of The Avengers, John Steed gets a card from her and wonders what she's doing in Fort Knox. And so they did a talent search, and Diana Rigg was judged to have the most M appeal, masculine appeal. And they put her in jumpsuits, and obviously not all of them were leather, but gussets.
You started out more with leather, then came Technicolor, and all of a sudden we were in violent shades of pink and so forth. Jim, do you feel the thing slipping your control already? Go ahead.
Nah,
purple.
I can go make me a cup of tea while y'all go forth and congregate.
I can't remember her name, but there was somebody who was cast before Diana Rigg, and I know this because she was a guest at the Mid-Atlantic Nostalgia Convention several years ago. I can't remember her name, but apparently she did not work out, and they brought Diana Rigg.
Yeah, if she was there, she does not show up in the because Greg and I purchased all of the Avengers going back to the very beginning
that are available, because not all of them are.
They didn't make. She didn't work out to the point where they never really completed an episode.
Yeah. So I was just saying she wasn't in the ones that we got. So she was really fast, But
I don't know if it's actually been done or not. They've actually talked about recreating the lost episodes, and redoing them. I know at one point it was cast. I don't know if it ever got made or not. But let's just sort of start with that idea of where everybody got their first taste of the Avengers, right? I mean, this was that heyday of spy TV. As we've already hinted, a lot of the legacy of the Avengers came out through Bond films. We actually see a lot of kind of the tropes, some of the gadgets, some of the myth and legend coming out of the Avengers, influencing things that we see later on in Bond films as the Avengers kind of goes through sweeps of, hey, we're going to be reality to, oh, let's go futurist, a little sci-fi, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of the other. So I remember watching the Avengers in a lot of reruns, this Man from Uncle, all that sort of stuff. Loved the reruns. So Jeannie, where did you get your first taste and introduction to the Avengers that you remember?
Well, it was in reruns for me as well, but it was just, evening television, watching and sometimes Saturday afternoon, watching these different shows, and then seeing a woman who had, and I now can call it what it is, a woman who had agency and who was a partner without there being anything hinky about it, at least not at first. And it being just sort of matter of fact. I loved that it was just this matter of fact, we're partners, we both have our skill sets, we're going to get the job done, plus a whole big mystery. And I loved that. So yeah, Saturday afternoon and sometimes evening reruns of Emma and Steed.
Stephanie?
I know this. I know this is for a fact because I used to try to stay up and watch Benny Hill on MPT. But after Benny Hill, and we would sneak to do it because we loved it. But before Benny Hill, right before we lost TV altogether, there was Get Smart. And after Get Smart, the last show before the crackling windows and, the pretty pictures that makes it look like, we're trying to remind each other to calm down in the middle of the apocalypse. I don't know if you guys remember those little palatial scenes. They used to play horses running and look like a funeral. And then you would get the Star Spangled Banner and everything would die. The last thing that would come on was the Avengers. And I remember the first time I watched it, you had Mrs. Peel, not just Miss Peel, Mrs. Peel, very politely slinking across it was like a tunnel or something, like a little hutch or something. And she climbs out, shakes herself off, whips out her gun, and proceeds to protect John Steed. And then later on in the episode, she came up with the solution on her own. And then the wonderful flirting that they did. There was tension between the two, but it wasn't sexual tension.
Right.
He respected her as Mrs. Peel, and he was Mr. Steed. And as much as they would get in each other's face and flirt and joke around, it was neither, is he going to get the girl? Is he not? There was no subplot of sexual context between the two of them. They were just very, very good partners who became very, very good friends through hardships and, survival. And to me, that was such a wonderful thing because a lot of friends that I had at that point were boys. And I was in one guy's basement with a bunch of them playing, D&D, but, Mountain Dew and the Funyuns. And people thought that was crazy. And it was like most of my friends are male because I'm a tomboy and they like most of the things I do. So like you said, was matter of fact. I was like, aha, that's proof that men and women can be friends and just friends. And then I went the next day to watch it. And sorry, I fell in love with Wardrobe. I have to say it. She looked badass.
So totally.
She was wearing. She made me want one with my little toothpicky skinny body. But she was style. And at least they gave me an excuse for it. They didn't want her tight clothes to drag. Her loose clothes to drag when she was running and jumping.
So, John, when did you want to get your leather jumpsuit?
No. But my father and I watched it in the original American broadcast. I believe it was Friday nights. We would stay up late, and it wasn't late. It was about 10 o'clock or something. And that was just one of the things we did on Friday night is we watched the Avengers. And at the time, it was just an adventure movie, adventure TV show for me. It was a spy movie. I was too young to appreciate the interplay. It was only later when I got the Avengers DVD set with the Emma Peel Avengers DVD set, because I had no interest in Tara King. She was fun, but I wasn't going to buy a DVD. That I started appreciating Emma Peel as what they were doing with Emma Peel. She was one of the first women on television who not only did not need saving, but would actually save her partner. And like Stephanie said, there was none of this. There was friendship, there was flirting, but there was no sexual tension. You knew they were just good friends, and anybody who tries to read something else into it is just basically might as well just write their own fanfic. I liked how they stuck to the British convention that she was Mrs. Peel and he was Steed, because that's how you address even Holmes and Watson, the best friends, called each other Holmes and Watson. And she was Mrs. Peel because it was legally she was still married. Her husband just was missing, and he hadn't been found yet. So so again, if she was Miss Peel or if she was a widow, we don't know what would have happened between her and Steve. But as it came out when the final episode, she was married.
Mm-hmm.
Ed, how about you?
Well, for me, I don't remember when in New York it was on. We had more channels than a lot of places. But what I remember is falling completely in love with Emma Peel at about age 10. And she was just fascinating. As everybody else has said, she was a different sort of character. She had agency. She was tough in her own right, smart, fully a compliment for her partner. The two of them, sort of occupied equal spaces. You didn't see that much in any other male-female pairing. Like even in Get Smart, Barbara Feldon was interested in Maxwell Smart, and he was usually completely clueless about that. So you would have that sort of dynamic in the American stuff. And there was just something about, I always has been something about her. And I followed Dinah Rigg's career through all of it. Saw her on Broadway live one time, which was a big thrill. And I was fascinated, compelled by her humor. Just, that wonderful, wonderful symmetrical face. And I wasn't one of the kids who, as her mother said, used to write romantic letters to her, and she would write back saying, "My daughter is too old for you, get a life." But I thought about it.
Jean Marie?
Well, basically my first introduction to the Avengers was in a teen magazine that mentioned them. And at the time, I was living in Frankfurt, Germany on a military installation, and our television just didn't exist. We still had our TVs because we had brought them over because theoretically they would work if you had the right transformer. But in point of fact, there was nothing to watch because Armed Forces Radio Network was not radio and television network at that point in time. But I turned it on one day, and there in German was Mrs. Peel and Steed. And it was very odd, the dubbing, but there they were. And I knew I wanted to watch it. So when we finally returned to the States in 1968, I was watching the last season on network TV, because by that point they put it on network TV, whereas it had not always been on network TV. Some of the smaller networks had it, but not necessarily ABC, NBC, and CBS. And then it went into reruns, and then they brought in Tara King, who was also on network TV. And a couple of years after Tara King wandered off, they had Joanna Lumley. But they had the originals in reruns started pretty quickly. And so I continued to watch them, and I love them because Mrs. Peel was definitely what, we all aspired to as intelligent, would-be liberated females. We wanted to be smart as a whip. We wanted to be tough enough to take on anybody. We wanted to have beautiful clothes. I mean, being a badass and having a good wardrobe are not mutually exclusive. However, I would say that I would disagree. I would say there was sexual chemistry between Diana Rigg and on-screen sexual chemistry between Diana Rigg and Patrick Macnee. But the writing was always there, left everything up to your imagination. You could imagine them having an affair. I mean, there are a couple of lines in the one where the black and white one, where they're in the department store, where basically she's working the counter, and Steed comes up and said, "Oh my, when they told me Mrs. Peel was in ladies' underwear, I took the stairs 3 at a time." So obviously he was good to see her in fancy lacy underthings. But there was also, with that said, there was also the fact that it was G-rated and nothing was happening on screen. The dialogue left it up to your imagination. And the other thing that came through was that they had so much mutual respect. There was a lot of respect between John Steed and Kathy Gale. But I think that Honor Blackman played a much more ferocious character. Diana Rigg had that difficult balance between competence and the appearance of femininity. I mean, honestly, I know that Steed had a sword in his cane and his umbrella could shoot bullets, or a sword in one of his umbrella, and another one could shoot bullets. But honestly, the one I'd be scared of in a dark alley would be Kathy Gale. Diana Rigg would dispatch you, but she wouldn't go after you if you weren't necessarily going after her. Kathy Gale would go until you were ground into dust.
Well, let's actually spend a little bit of time, talking about some of the varied partners, because I think, for a lot of us, especially an American audience, even though she was really series 4 and 5, right? I mean, the series has been going on for several years by the time it came to the States, really. And I think ABC picked it up. Mm-hmm. So for a lot of us, Emma Peel it's John Steed and Emma Peel, right? I mean, that is the core pairing that most everybody know. That's what everybody saw. When we look at some of the different partners he had over the years, I mean, I actually liked Kathy Gale because of that idea of. Yeah,
I liked her. It's not that it's not that I disliked her. When I finally saw it, I thought they were great, and I thought that it was an incredibly interesting thing to do, to give that kind of ferocity to a woman in a TV show. It's just that it's a different characterization, a different play.
Well, that's what I was going to throw out there is that they weren't interchangeable. They were all unique characters.
Right.
That's what I'm kind of throw out there is what do you think about how they used the different partners over the years to really revitalize and give the show a different take and a turn?
Some of that, I think, was when color came in. Even the original Avengers series, the Diana Rigg original Avengers series, switched from being more or less serious to getting much more fanciful. Just like Lost in Space did when they made that switch over. And I think when you continued that with Tara King, it got to be much more comedy centric. Yeah. She was a much more bumptious character. She didn't have the sophistication, the elegant, cool appeal of Emma. and she didn't have the ferocity of Kathy Gale, who had been, in colonial conflicts and had been, was a much more, I think, hard-edged character than Emma Peel, who, for all of her abilities, had come from a fairly privileged, background. She was inclined to be adventurous, whereas I don't know that Kathy Gale's character actually got that choice. Adventure got thrust more on her.
And she was quite aggressive. I mean, I figured she needed to be with the scenarios that they were setting up for her. And Kathy Gale, it was a while before I even discovered there was anybody other than Emma Peel.
Right.
So when we finally got the Kathy Gale stuff, oh my goodness, she was like, but she had like this, her character seems to have like this 1,000-eyed stare, the 1,000-foot stare. That is like somebody, I don't want to pal around with her. Maybe I'll
She's got some backstory, man.
Oh my goodness. But that's somebody I'd like to sit in the bar and have a couple of beers with. And maybe I'll have you to watch my back because I know you're going to do what you need to do. But by that same token, like you said, the sophistication, Jean Marie, she did not have that sophistication and that subtle British sense of dry humor that, freaking Emma Peel had. And it was amazing to get a comparison between the two. Now, I didn't see too many but Diana Rigg. Maybe one or two, because, American audience, they wanted something more exciting. But, I mean, like I said, Kathy Gale was somebody who would be a friend that I would see out. Whereas Emma Peel, I would actually invite into my house without fear of them having a PTSD flashback.
And I have to agree with Ed. I think that the later ones, it's Tara, right? That was the actress.
Tara King. Tara King was the character.
I think at that point, they were trying to compete head to head with the Maxwell Smarts and the Pink Panther and the more comic things, whereas the previous ones were more in the Bond genre and era.
Yeah. I've only seen a few of the Honor Blackmans, and so I saw most of the. Originally, I saw most of the Emma Peel episodes as they came out, and then I remember the episode where Emma's husband is found and she goes off, and Tara King becomes John Steed. Actually, at that point, Tara King was not John Steed's partner. She was his assistant. She was the girl. Forgive me. She was the girl assistant. She was the one who would discover things but would need to be rescued. She was not as, sophisticated. She was not as smart. She would more than likely, if John Steed was Batman, she was Robin and needed to be rescued. The worst part to me of the Tara King era, Mother. He was just
annoying as hell.
Pardon?
Annoying as hell.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that if you would every once in a while Steed would get instructions, but you never really saw who gave him the instructions. He and Emma basically operated on their own. Mother was just I don't know. It's just it was a bad character.
Well,
it was like they needed to bring in some more comedy relief.
Yeah, well, I think that it is true that once they hit color, they were definitely competing with things like Maxwell Smart, but not just Maxwell Smart, but also The Man from U.N.C.L.E. I think that Mother was a direct play on that. Yes,
well, and
Mr. Waverly
as well.
And the Saint acted independently. The Saint had
Saint wasn't.
The Saint was originally a thief who did good things, like Raffles, who turned into it, and that's the way it was played as an independent contractor, if you will, who decided to do things usually because somebody decided he was to blame, And so he would clear his name.
We'd set it right, clear his name, yes.
Yeah, it was set it right and, profit if he could.
I hadn't thought about that. You're right, though, Jean Marie, that the Man from U.N.C.L.E. probably did really influence that shift.
And basically, that was based on, the idea for Man from U.N.C.L.E. came directly from Ian Fleming himself, who wanted to make more money. But I think that there was an element of surrealism in the black and white ones. I'm thinking of the ones where you had the literal house of cards, and the ones where they,
the house that Jack built.
Yes, exactly. And the one where Mrs. Peel was a literal canary on a trapeze.
Right.
They were played, I don't know if anybody has ever had to ever played in The Importance of Being Earnest. Earnest is only funny if everybody plays it dead straight. And they played it dead straight. But when they shifted to Linda Thorson, who did Tara King, you were dealing with somebody who read like she was 20. And there was no way for her to manage that, to play that straight. Also, she was very much in the sense of a dolly. If you remember the 60s and the way the mods referred to women, birds, and dollies, and birds were more or less equal because you might be sexist and misogynistic and all of that, but dollies were the ones that had no brains. And Linda Thorson played a dolly. You dress her up in pretty clothes. And that's what she was. And you're right, she had to be rescued from time to time to time. And then we come to the one that was after Tara King, the New Avengers, with Joanna Lumley playing a ballet, Purdy, and they had to give Steed a male assistant. And she was much more serious than Linda Thorson.
I think
but then again, her face was much more. All these women are in the 20s. I mean, Diana Rigg was like 27 when she played Mrs. Peel. But there was something more sophisticated about her face, something more sophisticated about Joanna Lumley's face. And then you have this beautiful, they're all beautiful women, Tara King, who looks like she's going to be carded into her 40s. So they kind of have to work with what they have.
She still looks I saw her last year at the Mid-Atlantic Nostalgia Convention. She doesn't look like she's in her 20s anymore, but she's aged. She has aged very well.
Yeah, and beautiful woman.
And the other thing about
she's got that water.
I'm not sure about Kathy Gale's actual status. I know that Tara King was an agent for the same service that Steed worked for. It was made clear in the American introduction that Emma Peel was a talented amateur.
Yes.
She was doing this because it was the right thing to do, not because anybody hired her or anybody paying, had drafted her. She was doing this because that was the right thing to do.
And also, she was bored.
It's very well in the British tradition, and that sort of thing, where you have these talented amateurs like Albert Campion or Simon Templar, who in the lead TV show at least was a gentleman adventurer who had given up stealing things.
Yes.
Had to.
It wasn't uncommon to use independent contractors. I believe somebody else referred to them as, talented people that were essentially stringers. You picked them up for missions and so forth, but they weren't, on the payroll, like being a CIA, agent where you were actually a government employee.
Fleming himself was a contractor in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But then again, the Brits kept, during wartime, Brits had a long history of sucking in all of their writers to work for intelligence, whether full-time or part-time. Even Sax Rohmer did a little bit.
Who else has the good ideas?
There is that. There is certainly that.
There's a science fiction novel written by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle. And again, I can't remember what it was, but there was definite proof that a extraterrestrial or an extrasolar system object was heading toward Earth. And the president put together two groups of experts.
Footfall is the
called in all the science fiction writers and divided them into two groups and said, this half assumes that they're going to be nice, they're going to be good. The other half assumes they're invading. Now, figure out the approaches. You know, which was, I mean, yeah, Niven and Pournelle were science fiction writers, so of course they would think of that. But that was, that was a brilliant idea. And, it's like I said, if you're going to bring in people to solve problems, you might as well bring in the writers.
They've at least been thinking about them.
So let's actually talk a little bit about some of the episodes. Because, I mean, again, there were times that they were very serious, right? It was very, it was very hard on, hard spy novels, right? Very hard spy stories. It was the intelligence. It was going through, doing the mission needs what needs to be done. Some of the ones that I remember most are actually probably the campier ones, the ones that kind of reflected a little bit more of that Bond, like the man-eating plants. I will never forget the man-eating plants episode. I don't know why that's one
of the Triffids
sticks with me. Other than the fact, the first time I saw Little Shop of Horrors, I was like, I know where that came from. But are there particular episodes that really still kind of come back and stick with you that really exemplify a particular period of time for the Avengers? Because I think this is one of the things, is that it was always changing, it was always evolving, kind of for the period and the time. It's just
for me.
Go ahead, Ed.
I'm sorry, Stephen. I didn't mean to steal your limelight. You give it back to her.
Yay, reclaiming my time. But one of the episodes that I remember most was the mod thing, when they actually had them in the funhouse. And there was the mirror thing when they were going through the mirrors, and then she was running, and I was thinking to myself, how come she never ran into, a glass mirror or something? Wow, look at the floor, lady. But all the psychedelic colors when they fell into the pit. And I was thinking, it's like a bunch of people getting together and doing a Batusi. But I do remember that mirror scene because of the confusion and horror that was on her face, on Mrs. Peel's face when she was going through that. You can tell it looked like some things in her past, or maybe some self issues were popping up when she was running through that thing. And I always thought that was one of the most contemplative ones that we saw her in. And I mean, I just remember that friggin' Funhouse of Horrors.
I think that's the one, the house that Jack built. Yeah.
Yeah.
Real science fiction episode.
So I did tend to like the more psychedelic, off the wall stuff. And that's half of it has to do with my age. I know that because I was really young and I was attracted to the bright colors and wild shapes. And I thought walking around saying poetry and snapping my fingers was really, really cool. So anything that fell into that category for a time, I was absolutely positively enthralled with. As I got older, I tended to want more of the mystery than the fun goings on that was going behind the scenes. So, I mean, I guess as the times change, they actually change the characters to try to keep up with whatever society is doing, just to hold the interest.
And do you think that also reflects, I mean, because again, it kind of encapsulates the society at the time. And I think one of the things that also we saw that was a big change was when went from being primarily for British audiences to where they were trying to meet both British and American audiences. And there was a lot of retooling there, it felt like, when you watch those storylines.
Yeah,
Well, I think there's a whole section where it seemed like one week they would do a more serious story and it would be much more about the mystery. And those were the ones I loved. And then the next week it would be much more either sly humor or a little more broader comedy. And I think that probably was because they were trying to serve two masters.
Yeah. The ones I remember, one of my favorites was the one they were at university, and it was toward the end it was a fancy dress, and Steve was one of the British kings, and Mrs. Peel was Robin Hood. And that was despite that, it was one of the mysteries. They had to try to figure out who did it. The other one's one of my favorites was, somebody's going to have to help me out. That there was this rather unstoppable automaton that showed up.
Cybernauts?
Cybernaut. Return of the Cybernaut. And in the New Avengers, there was actually a Cybernaut, and Steed wound up calling Mrs. Peel, and she did a cameo to remind Steve how they brought him down the first place. One, it was, I didn't realize this the first time I saw it, but when we rewatched it, it was the one somebody mentioned, the one where they were where Mrs. Peel was undercover in a department store.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And she was at the toy counter. And on the toy counter is a very small daily.
Yep.
So there was a little nod to Doctor Who.
Yep.
Doctor Who there,
Yep.
Well,
I think that all of there was a tremendous conversation going on in the later Avengers. I always get sort of sidetracked in the early series by the fact that when they started with Ian Hendry and where Steed was the sidekick, you get sidetracked looking at the terrible sets that are very obviously in a TV studio, and the quality is so bad. And then of course as you go further and further, you get less generic room sets and more involved plotting, okay? And that's going through with the Kathy Gales, and you get to the Avengers, and then suddenly the whole level of professionalism rises. But they were still reusing plots, and this was very common throughout the 60s. It was something Warner Brothers TV did it all the time. You will sometimes see the plots going from one story to another. And I mean, how many times out there did a spy story do the plot about terrible tropical insects being raised to create a plague? And I love the way it was dealt with in the Avengers, with basically everything is set up to be this kind of Southeast Asian jungle thing, but it's in fact just a large warehouse that they've set up and kept to. And the way they dealt with this terrible plague of tsetse flies was to just put the jars out because it was raining in 55 degrees and they were dead.
English weather. Yeah.
English weather, it'll cure anything. Mars attacks. English weather will take care of them.
That's the reason why I always wondered about War of the Worlds, how they survived that long.
Yeah, really, seriously, I could see it in New Jersey in the summertime. It's hot, but in Grover's Mill, somewhere from July to October, you could get some hot days in there. Yeah, maybe if Mars is arid in a desert, they could handle the English weather. Forget about it. But the things that stuck in my mind were how they slid in sci-fi concepts, the cybernauts being one. Mm-hmm. And then the other one where they basically had figured out this is a real sci-fi idea, that the human body, every human body had a number of heartbeats. It had an allotted span of heartbeats. And basically, once you hit that allotted span of heartbeats, you were going to keel over, no matter what. And so they built an entire episode around it, and it didn't read like science fiction. It read like possibility. But then, you come back years later and you look after episode after episode after episode, and you've got this wonderful integration of sci-fi with the mystery. This is all happening in today's London. It's just normal.
That was one of the things I liked about some of the earlier episodes. Most notably, they had one, it was a black and white episode, where this guy who had been with the OSS during the Second World War, one has to realize that the Second World War was kind of backdrop for a lot of this. Steve had been a pilot in the Second World War. And this guy, he had been killing German officers using essentially, booby traps. And he had come up with an electrified pen that could be used to essentially knock off CEOs of various companies, which would allow you to say, just a wild idea, that somebody whacked Elon Musk. All of a sudden, Twitter might be worth something again. So, they just kind of took this idea, and, it was pretty much of a straight economic,
lesson?
An economic disaster episode, a financial espionage situation. And then you had the Cybernauts, which was, again, more of a science fiction scenario. So they kind of went all over. They got a little bit, I think, broader as they got into color. And I think that was just sort of just the effect of color and everything from Batman to Get Smart to whatever. All of a sudden, there was a sort of campiness that came into TV.
Yeah, like Charlie's Angels. Charlie's Angels stole a lot from the Avengers.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one, if you're talking about, shall we say, inspiration, after they did The Man from U.N.C.L.E., they had a season or two of The Girl from U.N.C.L.E. Of course, The Girl from U.N.C.L.E., not The Woman from U.N.C.L.E. And April Dancer had a male partner, and they had essentially a professional relationship, and there might have been some flirting, but there was absolutely no, and G-rated, there was absolutely nothing, no hint that things were going on between the two of them. Unlike when they teamed April Dancer and Napoleon Solo, there was some heat there. There was no heat when they teamed Ilya Kuryakin and April Dancer's partner.
That was Yvonne Craig, wasn't it? The lady that played Batgirl?
No, Yvonne Craig was Batgirl.
Yeah.
Stephanie Powers was the girl.
That's right. So, Jeannie,
Noel Harrison, Rex Harrison's son, played Mark Slade. And I remember way too much of this. God knows what important information ever got in because I remember this stuff.
That's okay. I've got the Man from U.N.C.L.E. box set over there in the little metal briefcase. So, Jeannie, are there any particular episodes or anything like that you remember, things that really set in for you? That
there are bits and flashes of episodes, but I can't call a specific one to mind, other than I remember the department store one very well, and I just remember loving the ones that were more the mystery rather than the more campy ones. I loved the mystery ones. I wanted more of that. I was like, so annoyed. It's another one of these ones where they're making fun of something or it's very simple to solve or whatever. I said, okay, I'll sit through it, but I want the ones that are serious.
One thing I always liked was, I think it might have been the second season, was all the different ways Steed had to let Emma know Mrs. Peel were needed.
What I liked was you got some tremendous guest stars in there.
Oh, yeah.
My favorite episodes was a color episode. Charlotte Rampling was in it. Donald Sutherland. I think Brian Blessed. They were all a group of unique fighters, and you've seen this plot from everywhere from Marion Zimmer Bradley's Hunters of the Red Moon to Predator movies. A bunch of unusually talented combatants are dropped on this island, and then they're sort of picked off one by one. And the question is there an insider or an outsider? And they just had, where are you going to get a group of talent like that? Charlotte Rampling. And then you had other ones. Peter Cushing was in the second Cybernaut one.
Right. And Christopher Lee was in, I think, the first one. Yeah. And
he I'm not sure if he was in the first one, but he was in one where he was a guy that kept getting killed and coming back to life.
Right. Oh, yeah. That one. Yes.
Yeah. It was a color episode also. And, pretty much everybody that was anybody in England popped up in these episodes at one time or another.
Well, it's such a small group of people to choose from.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I've heard it said that there are really only 40 actors in England.
Yeah. At any given time.
And Elliot Durnholm is 5 of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was like, wait a minute. I saw you in Doctor Who, and now you're a spy for this other agency.
Mm-hmm.
At least in England, they go by talent, not by looks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. My wife and I watch the British crime shows at night. And every once in a while we'll have to pause and see where this one person, what other shows this one person was. I think actually one of the really good was the Mrs. Bradley movie, Mrs. Bradley Mysteries, which starred Diana Rigg,
mm-hmm.
and her chauffeur / Watson later starred in Midsummer Murders as John Barnaby, and Diana Rigg, Mrs. Bradley, was at a school, and one of the professors was David Tennant, and the police inspector, Inspector Christmas, was Peter Davison. So you had so you had two people who had played Doctor Who or were going to play Doctor Who. You had Emma Peel and you had somebody from Midsummer Murders, all in the same show.
Yeah, I mean,
there was a cute reunion of those two in there's this ridiculous British antique roadshow where they go on the road in 2 antique cars with 2 dealers, and then Diana Rigg was in one of them, and the guy that was in the Bradley murders was with her, so they were kind of reunited, and he was actually driving her around, so it was sort of fun.
I mean, that's like Murder, She Wrote.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen them a million times, but we're playing this new game. Me and my best friend, we gotten to the point. It's like a sip of beer every time somebody that you have seen who's starred in something else, but you have to call out their name. Like that's Janeway over there. And, take a little sip. We had to, because we tried to do shots one time, and it was like 2 shots in. And I was like, no, I don't think my liver can take it.
Not going to make it to the commercial break, huh?
Starting to talk about doing shots. Back in the 70s, they tried to go with the new Avengers, right? They went for the whole spinoff. They tried to bring it back, and it was really primarily done for really a much more American audience, right? That was really what it was spun off to come back for. I remember some of those being really just forgettable episodes, and that's probably the reason
I don't remember any of them except the Cybernaut one, and only because Diana Rigg was in it for like 3 minutes.
They basically
I remember one rather famous one with the Tara King that always struck in my mind was they're investigating brainwashing by way of romance novels.
You mean they don't do that?
Well, no, basically what was happening was they were putting microdots on the page in certain patterns that would inspire people to basically tell secrets. And the more you read the book, the more the more this would impress upon your brain. And the whole thing, the books were being written by an AI, and it's like,
oh,
I vaguely, very, very vaguely remember a part of that.
That was the one Tara King that stuck in my mind. And it's obviously, as somebody who wanted to be a writer, it was like, and it's a combination of, oh my God, this is hysterical. And the other thing is, you guys really don't like romance, do you?
When you started talking about it, had microdots, I was wondering what they were doing to lick them.
Sort of getting back to your observation there, the big problem with that series was that you had a fine acting cast, you didn't have writers.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
They just weren't giving anything to do. I mean, Joanna Lumley is obviously a tremendous talent. I didn't see the guy who played Gambit in too many things after that. I think he passed away young, but he was kind of a ferocious counterpart to John Steed, which I thought made him interesting, because Patrick Macnee had an interesting thing about Steed, which is why Steed very rarely ever carried a gun. He had been in the Second World War. In fact, he fought in motor torpedo boats, which were always getting into scuffles with the Germans in the Channel, particularly against the larger and better armed German E-boats. And he lost a lot of friends. And in fact, his vessel went out on a mission. He was sick that day, and the torpedo boat was destroyed, and everybody he served with was killed. And when they talked to him about the Avengers, they said, "Well, you're going to be this guy. You'll be carrying a weapon." And he was like, "Yeah, I'm not going to be doing that. I've seen guns kill too many people. It's not going to be part of this character." So he kind of took an early and interesting stand on that. In fact, most of the time somebody got shot, Emma shot them.
Right.
Like in that,
one memorable episode for me was one of their England has been infiltrated, and all the bad guys are underground. They did at least two of them, and there was one where Steed was about to be executed. Mm-hmm. And Emma and Mrs. Peel comes around the corner with a machine gun, mm-hmm. and mows down all the bad guys.
Stephanie, I think that was the episode you were referencing, that she comes out of a tunnel and she, none of whom explode into sprays of blood and bone too. The Avengers was pretty sanitized in regard to, getting shot.
But you don't often see one of the heroes machine gun a room full of people.
Yeah. Well,
not in that day.
They were a firing squad. They weren't, used car salesmen or anything.
Well, and the BBC's budget for blood was pretty low, so.
Yeah. Well,
it was a plug and drop.
The sensibility for physical violence simply wasn't there. I do remember one episode where Emma gets, hit in the face with a rifle butt. And then 2 hours later, she wakes up, makeup's not smudged, hair's perfect, gets up and goes off. Most of us would have spent the next 3 weeks recovering.
So,
well,
it's not fun.
No, they're not.
Back in the face with a stock in the head. Yeah, you're not getting up anytime soon.
So ignoring
people would. I mean, after all that many times you've been knocked out, you'd be peeing through a catheter. I mean, the traumatic effects of violence were not really dealt with in any of this.
No, because violence was fun.
So ignoring the movie with Ralph Fiennes and everybody a few years ago,
there was no movie. It was all a horrible nightmare.
A lightning storm.
It was a horrible nightmare. Yes, it was.
And I was never so grateful for a lightning storm to have knocked out the theater. I left and never did see the end of the movie.
So ignoring that movie, what do you guys think that the legacy is of the Avengers? Because I think we saw the influence work its way through a lot of both British and American media, TV, film, books, and I mean, it was part of the culture at the time, right? But what do you guys think that the ultimate legacy is going to be of the Avengers? I mean, we just passed the 60th anniversary of the show. We're at 62 years, I think. But I mean, what do you think the ultimate impact and legacy is of a show where we still remember somebody who was only on as 2 seasons as being part of the fundamental identity?
Capable women. Oh my goodness, she was one of the first who was not there to make the hero, or she wasn't the little Pollyanna or always cute, girl Friday secretary from the 50s type of person either. She came in there and she said she was a scientist. She saved Steed more than once. She could go out of her way and save herself. She was independent and she carried her marriage vows seriously. So she was doing all of that in an era where you didn't even see that often. And if they did have the woman there, it was usually a guy who gave her a hint or a clue and gave her a book to read. And she came up with, oh, here's a hint I found here. She was actually for herself going out and doing things. She didn't let being around a bunch of men bother her. She could adapt to just about every situation. And like I said, she had that subtle sophistication that you would see in a spy that nobody else pulled off. It made you want to get a champagne glass and hold your pinky out while you drink it. I mean, she was just that polite, perfect all around, they would say a Sigma male, but I would say at that point she would be a Sigma female.
Yeah. I think the influence is, first of all, like Stephanie said, she was one of the first women to do all that. Plus, there's the Avengers, as we're speaking of them, are still around. There every once in a while another comic book comes out. I would recommend Batman 66 meets Steed and Mrs. Steel, where and yes, the Cybernauts are in it, but there are a lot of writers of my generation and others who have seen it. Basically, they pattern their characters. Steed was the quintessential British gentleman, and there are a lot of them out there. But if you want to see what somebody can do with an Emma Peel type character, there's Carrie Greenwood's Phryne Fisher mysteries. She and Emma. She and Mrs. Peel would basically bond and go out and have drinks, and then and then go kick ass on their own. And I will admit that I have a few female characters who were in part, at least, inspired by Emma Peel. There's one that's coming out. It's called Detectives of the Abyss, and the main character is Jane Watson, Dr. Watson's daughter, Sherlock Holmes's goddaughter, and she's definitely based on Emma Peel because she's the type of person who will smuggle a silver-bladed dagger into Dracula's castle because she can. I think we may not be seeing, we may not help us. I hope we never see a revival of Steed and Mrs. Peel because they're not going to get it right. But we see Emma Peel is still alive in all the other female characters who are out there who don't need saving.
Some of the males.
That's absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Stephanie.
I was like some of the males too, because I see a lot of the Avengers in graphic novels like The Kingsman. They borrow heavily not only from the James Bond series, but from the Avengers. You can see it in the way they react to each other. You can see it in what they consider proper behavior and what's not. You can see it in the camaraderie between the two. I mean, you wouldn't expect them to get together because they're two, guys who, have specific females and things in mind, but they still have that really tight mentor-student relationship that turns into almost like a father figure and friendship. So I see a lot of their interaction in shows like the modern shows like The Kingsman.
Well, I think that, the idea of a couple that is equal is something that keeps coming back. And it was one of the first shows to do that. and basically you keep doing it. I don't know if anybody remembers The Secret Adventures of Jules Verne from the early aughts, where they definitely had a Steed Peel thing going on between Phileas Fogg and his sister, his cousin, Francesca, who may or may not have been marriage material, but he definitely wanted it. But it wasn't the same thing, but she was definitely an Emma Peel character. I think you also had the idea that a woman could be all the things, that a woman could be a kick-ass woman. She could be sophisticated and kick-ass. She could be intelligent and kick-ass. She could have a great wardrobe and be kick-ass. She could have money and privilege and be kick-ass and care about doing right. But I think that also something that is a thread that keeps moving through is the idea, well, first of all, urbanity, which you see in the Kingsman, for example, and also intelligence, that those two virtues, the idea of being urbane, being a person who can function in society and function gracefully in society, and somebody for whom intelligence is absolutely essential to do their job, those two things are something that carry on. It is always a minority thing in media, because media tends to go towards the lowest common denominator. How many explosions can you fit into one thing? But keeps coming up the idea that intelligence has value, urbanity, sophistication has value. And I think that that value, plus the idea that women and men can operate as equal partners, keeps coming up. And, every new generation keeps discovering it in some, way, whether it be Secret Adventures of Jules Verne, The Kingsman, or, all these other things that are not taking the, quote, gritty side of things. The boys, I'm looking at you. But are taking the idea, like Phryne Fisher, that intelligence is cool, effective, and sexy. And we keep bringing that back to remind people that it is cool, effective, and sexy. Because you can beat up the bad guys, but what happens if you are incapacitated? Then you're stuck with your wits. And if you don't have any wits...
You said that, and immediately Pacific Rim popped into my mind. Because not only was she running the base, she was highly intelligent. She was sophisticated. She had fashion sense for what they had to do work with. She was equal to her partner. And at the end of all of this, they had the will they, won't they, and they didn't. It was like, we are very good partners. We have been inside each other's heads, and there's mutual respect there. Oh my goodness, so much intelligence, because he was a musclehead. Let's just face it, he really was. And she was.
She's gonna pick a musclehead. I mean, they showed what Emma Peel was going to pick at the end of the show. It was a Steed clone.
Yeah, my goodness, that was hysterical.
Well, and I think
Actually,
you see that.
There was I think it was a novel, that took place after the end of the Emma Peel TV show, and she was talking to her husband, and in the novel, that was sort of an arranged joke on Steed, where he would have the bowler hat, he would have the umbrella, and they would drive off. But in the novel, it explained that was sort of a joke, or a joke on Steed. But then something happened to him, and she wound up teaming up.
Jeannie?
I think you see the effect of it, though, carrying all through the 70s and 80s. I mean, the Charlie's Angels, Stephanie mentioned that earlier. You see it in Moonlighting. You see it in Remington Steele. Yeah, you see it in a lot of movies of the time where that partnership works up all the way up into Castle and, what's the other one that was the same time?
Bones?
Yeah, Bones. But you also see it in movies where, you've got the very competent person in Lara Croft, for example, who is all of those Emma Peel things. She's both kick-ass, but she can pull off an evening gown like nobody's business. Even in so far as Mr. and Mrs. Smith, where they're both adversaries and married, that you see that kind of not even the push me pull you of the Mrs. Smith, but the tension between who's got this one, right? Is this your job or is this my job? But I think you see that influence all the way into the present, because really they were the first to be that sort of equal partner thing. I was trying to think before we got on the panel because I looked up to see if the Dick Van Dyke Show, which has been heralded as one of the first times a couple are seen as partners in parenting and partners in a relationship on television. I was trying to see, and they're contemporaneous. So I found that very interesting, that idea, the sort of 40s, 50s ideas of the little woman staying at home had begun already to change and was celebrated. But I think because it was celebrated, it was actually pushed a little bit. And I think that we still are seeing Mrs. Peel, as John said, it shows up in all of our work because we love her. No matter which actress played her, although Diana Rigg's my favorite, we still see it because she's got it. She can wear it. She can shoot it. She can do the chemistry. It's all good.
And she could.
The Avengers were kind of that cultural touchstone, kind of like Star Trek was, that there was a before and after.
Mm-hmm.
And before, you didn't have this sort of character. After, this character had to be dealt with in some fashion. Once you'd gone from like the all-white crew of the C-57D Forbidden Planet to the multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-gender crew of the Enterprise, there wasn't really any going back to that. This was now the new reality.
Jeannie was out of the box.
Amen.
Well, I think that's a place to wrap this one tonight. But before we do that, let's make sure everybody knows where to find you guys. Website, social media, new releases, all the good stuff. So, Jeannie?
Well, you can find me at jeanneadams.com. You can find me a lot here on ConTinual. And you can find me on most social media sites as Jeanne Adams, except Instagram, where I'm JPA Griffin. My most recent release was in June in the Caneham Castle series with several of our wonderful ConTinual friends. And the story I have in that anthology is in my Witches Walk series. So that's me.
Stephanie?
You can find me on authorstephanieburke.online, or you can just type in Stephanie Burke. I'm fairly everywhere. All my social media connections are found on my website and on my Facebook page, and I think my Twitter page. And if you want to dig really, really deep, you can find it on my Tumblr page. The latest release that I had was the continuation and the third of the trilogy in the Dragon series, where I have Dragon Master, which is the last book of this sci-fi, twisted, everything represented kind of a romp. And I'm proud to say that my book, The Slayer, is now in hardback. So check that one out too, if you like vampires and mysteries. And yes, the heroine in this one is very much like Emma Peel.
John?
Okay, my latest book is Wages of Sin, S-Y-N, and it was published by Boventure Press. It is a throwback to a different kind of TV show, Have Gun Will Travel. Jericho Sin, aka the Scarecrow, is the guy you see when no one else. And as I mentioned before, for upcoming is Detectives of the Abyss, which features Dr. Jane Watson, who gets involved in several different mysteries and winds up in Transylvania trying to solve a murder in Dracula.
Ed?
Well, for me, you can find me with Copper Dog Publishing, a company that carries me and that I'm involved in. All my stuff's available on Amazon, as I mentioned. Thanks even showing up for for the Morrow series, the little AI who continually could, and for other writings, you can find me on Facebook. Also, I'm not hard to dig up.
Jean Marie?
Well, you can find me at JeanMarieWard.com. I'm on Twitter and Instagram, though Twitter, or should we call it X? I don't know. It'll probably change again next week. But my handle there is Jeanne_Marie_Ward on there, and on Twitter, X, or whatever Folly Musk has done next. I'm on Facebook as Jeanne Marie Ward, and my most current releases are Siren Bridge, which, as I said, is a comic fantasy western about Oleander Jones, who is absolutely no better than she should be. And she's very proud of that. And for something completely different, I have a story in the Zombies Need Brains anthology, Dragonesque, called Lord By and the Magic Pirate, which is basically about what happens when I let loose a dragon in the middle of a government conference, because I always wanted one to burn the place to the ground. So
when it should have been a memo.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, you can find me there or at ConTinual, where I, like Jeanne Adams, get into all sorts of trouble.
And you can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentialsworkshops.com, the speculative fiction academy.com, creatingprose.com, and of course, here at ConTinual. And I'm going to go grab my bowler hat and tip everyone a good night.